All right, good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, I should say, to those who are joining us from the United States. You may join us from other parts of the world as well, and it may be good evening for you. I am Frederick Eriksson, and I'm very pleased to host this session we're going to have here this afternoon. We still have people joining us here at Zoom, and people also watching us on other platforms. So. And it should be sort of a really fascinating discussion we're going to have here this afternoon, because I am joined by a panel of 4 persons who are going to help me to understand transatlantic economic cooperation and whether the new initiative, the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council, the shorthand for it is TTTC, can help the two sides to perhaps forge a closer bilateral relations on certain type of issues, and perhaps it's an initiative that also can help to shape issues for the global economy. That's the issues that we're going to talk about here today. Those who are joining me are in alphabetic order. Matthias Bauer, who is a senior economist at ESIP. Elena Bryan was previously a senior US government official. She's now a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund as well as at ESIP. We have Ed Gresser just joining us, very much just in time delivery here. So great to see you, Ed. He is the Vice President and Director for Trade and Global Markets at the Progressive Policy Institute, and has been working at the United States Trade Representative for 2 former USTRs. And then we have Stormy Annika Mildner, who is the Executive Director of the Aspen Institute Germany, and who, among other things, was formerly the Head of Department for External Economic Policy at the German Business Federation, BDI. Thank you so much to all of you for agreeing to join us for the discussion that we're going to have here. And I want us to start talking a little bit about your expectations for the new transatlantic initiative. And perhaps we can start with our American friends that are joining us. I'm going to go to you first, Elena. So I think there will be some degree of cynicism in how many people view this new initiative. Some will say we've been here before, referencing initiatives like, for instance, the Transatlantic Economic Council and TTIP. And the question then becomes, what is different this time? What has changed that should make us think of the new initiative as being one that has a much greater chance of success?
Thank you, Frederick. So from my perspective, the TTTC, this is a thing you can't say it. We used to say TTIP and tech, but you have to pause and actually say the words.
There are many T's there.
Yeah, has the new structure, I think, reflects some of the lessons learned from the tech and TTIP. First, it's not a trade agreement. This is a forum for discussing issues of particular concern and multiple interest. TTIP was a trade agreement that was run by USTR, and we tried to put regulatory issues in it, and that didn't work so well. It also had to deal with a lot of long-term contentious bilateral issues between the US and EU. So TTTC is a series of working groups that are led by the agencies, I think on both sides of the water, that are in the lead for those issues. So that's a positive point. It's not about a binding contractual agreement like the TTIP was to be, which reduces the pressure to come up with particular outcomes, I think. And the other thing is, one of the lessons from the tech, which was a looser discussion, is that you need to be very careful with the kinds of issues that you put into the discussion, because some issues can blow up a discussion. And, ironically, one of the blow up issues in the tech was chicken treated with chlorine, which, you know, is still a discussion that goes on. So I'm hopeful that there will be positive outcomes from the TTTC. Maybe not in every group, but that's to be seen. And I hope it works.
All right, over to you, Ed. I mean, how do you look at this initiative itself? I mean, you, at least for during TTIP times, you had also the luxury of seeing it through the lens of the USTR and weigh up sort of the political considerations that form part of America's decision to launch that. What do you see anything that has changed now that should lead us to think either that the chances of success is better, or that perhaps that it's not a worthwhile initiative?
Well, my point of view is probably pretty similar to Elena's. I guess pulling back a bit, you mentioned cynicism. Cynicism is almost always a mistake, I think. It's the mirror image of naivete. If you think of naivete as going into something without really understanding how difficult it might be, or simply trusting people's word that they're always, you know, thinking in very high-minded terms, cynicism is sort of the opposite, going into something with the kind of unexamined conviction is probably going to fail, and probably nobody's in it for very good motives anyway. So I think cynicism is always a mistake. I think in comparison to the TTIP, and in fact, my memories of this go back even to an acronym that you didn't mention, the TEP, the Transatlantic Economic Partnership, which was, I believe, 1998, 99, 2000 or something. Lessons of a lot of these things to me have been that US-EU relationship is quite large, that a lot of it really goes quite well and works very well among individuals, people, families, businesses, and so forth. It doesn't, doesn't need fundamental change. Things that are not worked out are not worked out mainly because they're politically very difficult in the case of the chicken issue or steel issue or something like that. But others are difficult because they're conceptually difficult and they're fairly new. What is the proper approach to data localization issues? How does the US and the European Union and other major established economies view the rise of China and the adoption of various troubling policies by the Chinese government? How do we think about issues like in our country, the snarling up of global supply chains? These are particularly evident in US-Asia trade, less so US-EU trade. But those are, those conceptual issues are, I think as Elena was implying, they're not necessarily something you need to develop a binding agreement on. They're often things that you can compare approaches to, try to learn lessons from one another and adopt best practices, try to harmonize whenever possible. When you're thinking about issues posed by the rise or the policies of other countries, those are things we can think about. How do we best coordinate toward approach that will get the best outcomes for everyone? So, as Elena was saying, this is not a negotiation in which all issues are put on hold pending resolution of the most difficult ones. The most difficult ones are often not the biggest ones in terms of trade flows or employment. And so it is a somewhat different approach, and I think a good one.
All right, over to you, Stormy. The same question to you, sort of how you analyze this initiative. What do you think are the motivations? What are your expectations? And may I just add one particular question to it as well? I mean, am I right in thinking that in Europe, at least, that there may be a few more strategic considerations to this initiative than it may be in America, thinking that there has to be a better way, or at least a complementary way to many other things that are being done in Europe in order to address major global issues that are going to come along on the back of digitalizations and many other new technologies, and that we need to proper up whatever type of alliances that we can build here.
No, absolutely. First of all, Frederick, many thanks for the invitation. It's always great to participate in your discussion rounds. I would like to do a couple of things. First, remind us, as also Elena did, and Ed, of the lessons learned from Tech and TTIP. And I had the pleasure at that time being very close from the business side to both negotiations. And I wanted to at least share a few of the lessons learned from my point of view, and then also share some of my observations, what might be different, but where there are also some stumbling blocks. But to answer your second question, sure, there's a lot of strategic thinking on the EU side, and it is similar strategic thinking to when the TTIP negotiations started, because that was just when Foreign Secretary Clinton back then announced the pivot to Asia. Right. So there was a lot of anxiety also on the side of the Europeans that we are not the preferred, most important strategic partner for the US anymore, that we wanted to bind the US closer to us. So there was a very similar a great similarity to what you just said. And I think that is also a big motivation factor right now for the EU to look closer at the TTTC, TTEC. This is like the CPTPP. I mean, this is like all those acronyms with the individual letters, which are very close to each other. Awful. So lessons learned on the tech. I would identify 5 where the tech had some problems. The first one, a joint vision and a clear vision what the goals are supposed to be. And there were some divergences back then on both sides of the Atlantic, what the tech back then should focus on. Should it focus on agriculture issues or shouldn't it? Should it talk about sanitary and phytosanitary measures or shouldn't it? So there was some misunderstanding, I think, from the start on. The second one was having a clear agenda and a time frame with clearly set time frame for certain goals and interim steps. And the tech also ran into problems with regard to the timetable and also with regard to the structure back then. So it had a good working structure in a sense, but what was then after a while lacking quite quickly were the high level meetings where the, so to say, the dynamic for the whole process and the agenda setting really came from. So that is something which really was missing after a while in the tech, which I think is one of the important lessons learned, that you need to schedule high level meetings and that there needs to be a vision being transferred by the leaders from both sides of the Atlantic. So that's the structure, which is the third point. The fourth point is dynamics. You need to deliver pretty quickly on some wins, and you need to communicate these wins to create a dynamic situation. And the tech ran into pretty big problems there as well. The fourth point I would say is that you also need to have a stakeholder engagement process where the tech really lacked. So business was not officially integrated, for example, and also the regulatory agencies were not fully integrated in the process. And last but not least, the topics. You need to, that's my point number 5, you need to have a good balance between and which topics you want to exclude because they're too tricky, and which you can't exclude because they are so tricky. So you need to find a good balance. And also a couple of lessons learned from TTIP, which come on top of this, apart from stakeholder involvement and communications. I would say that it's really important that you find a good balance with regard to the level of ambition. TTIP was probably too ambitious, but that you also need to think already about ratification processes. Some of the things which are envisioned in the Trade and Technology Council would require legislative changes. on both sides of the Atlantic. So I would say you need to involve Congress from an early starting point. You need to involve the Parliament from European Parliament from an early starting point, and that needs to be taken into consideration. How do you want to close a negotiation? It's not a trade agreement, but still, even if you talk about some regulatory issues, they require legislative changes, and that is something which needs to be thought about. I think what makes this initiative a little bit different from the previous ones is the changing geopolitical environment. There is on both sides of the Atlantic a greater perceived need to come closer together on technology issues. It's a much smaller agenda. It is not a big trade agreement which needs to be ratified in a big way. It's not a single undertaking approach where you need to negotiate everything before it's going to be ratified. So I think there are lots of things which make it different, which increase the likeliness of it being a success, but there's still a lot of stumbling blocks on the way. And I'm pretty sure we come back to the stumbling block later after we started out with, so to say, a little bit of a more positive impression.
Very good. No, I mean, I think we're going to go back on basically everything you said there, Stormy. Thank you. Over to you, Matthias, with the same questions to you, but I'm also going to ask, I mean, you do a lot of work in the field of technology and technology regulation that are coming. And I think at least on my part, seeing this initiative coming was perhaps not so surprising, but there was one surprising element of it in the sense that at least from an inside Brussels Beltway point of view, you often get the impression that Europe doesn't really think about strategic policy collaboration with America as part and parcel of a strategy for how they're going to deal with new digital technology issues in the future. That quite often there seems to be more of a I wouldn't call it a combative, but at least it's a relation which are fraught with different type of policy frictions. So from your angle, Matthias, how do you sort of weigh up the different motivations and also the choice to focus a lot on technology issues?
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. Yeah, first of all, I think Elena is right, highlighting that what we are talking about is a forum that includes a series of workshops. And for this forum, political leaders made clear that it's important to protect fundamental human rights, core democratic values, but at the same time share a certain desire to preserve strong trade and relationships between the EU and the US. When it comes to the desire to preserve this relationship, I'm not so sure if this is actually what's the intention of the EU. Stormy pointed to the lack of involving the European Parliament when it comes to TTIP primarily. Freddie, you mentioned that you perceive, at least for Brussels or the center of the EU, that there is not so much a desire to shape a strategic relationship with like-minded partners such as the US, in not only in technology, but also in other policy areas that affect trade and investment. And this is my perception as well. After all, the EU is a conglomerate of individual member states who do not have the same political preferences when it comes to trade, investment, but also the shape of technology policy. When it comes to the TTTC, another key geopolitical ambition is to contain China's rising influence globally. And then we, of course, hear a lot about technology cooperation and cooperation towards future innovation leadership. I think when it comes to the overarching objectives in terms of jointly protecting shared core values, they are actually pretty clear. And when we think of them as major guidelines, I think they are not very likely to create severe political tensions in both jurisdictions, including in individual member states, unlike the TTIP, which lacked this overarching narrative and therefore stirred quite some backlash, particularly in Western Europe. And this is why the TEC, but also TTIP failed in the past. And other reasons were generally a lack of interest among leaders, a lack of interest among the administrations in charge of the design of economic policies, technology policies. In addition, there was unfavorable public opinion, deeper cultural cleavages, I would say, over why and how to regulate at all trade, technology, and so on. And I feel that some of these unfortunate circumstances will keep hovering over this new initiative. And I'm very doubtful whether we will see the political leadership that is necessary and also sufficient enough to overcome political cleavages and frictions, particularly within the EU, where member states' political cultures and larger economic interests are highly diverse. And then we should also think of China and not forget the differences regarding political preferences individual member states have regarding the question how to deal with China. And now the question that you mentioned, Frederick, how these circumstances impact on the success of this initiative, I think it depends. When it comes to the actual modes of cooperation, for example, further liberalizing trade and investment, developing and after all also implementing and enforcing joint technology standards, there will likely be disagreement over the nitty-gritty of policies for algorithms, data, technology-enabled business models, and this will effectively shrink. And I think it will significantly shrink the policy space for meaningful transatlantic solutions. But again, it certainly depends on where you look at.
All right, many thanks for that. Back to the United States here. And if I start with you, Elena, so am I right in thinking that there is, I mean, as always, there is a European angst related to America, which is either you are too big and too dominant, or you are too dismissive, or you neglect us here in Europe. So damn if you do, damn if you don't. But I think at least this is fueling a perception in at least some quarters in Europe, which is that an initiative like this has to have a core strategic component in order to succeed. And that's how you're going to build up the chances of success as well. But then we look to America, and we're struggling to figure out sort of where this policy sits in American politics and in the US broader strategy for dealing with systemic competition issues, most often from China, but potentially from other parts of the world as well, in terms of what rules and norms that are going to guide the 21st century economy. So America feels, I think, it more urgent to address these issues than Europe does, but it doesn't seem to think of Europe as a partner in addressing those more strategic issues. Am I right in that? You're mute, Elena.
Sorry. You know, the thing about the US and the EU going back for decades, and this was certainly a thing in TTIP. The good news was that we all knew each other and we knew what the issues were. And the bad news is that we all know each other and we know what the issues are. And I mean, I felt the angst when I lived in Brussels, but I feel the angst here in Washington and across the US too, because we're in a very domestically focused mode right now. And not just because we have an election in another year. We had an election a year ago, we have another election. But I think as a country, we're trying to come to terms with all kinds of things, including how to deal with China. We've just spent 4 years with the focus on that didn't turn out very well, and we still have the hangover from that. I also think that when you talk in Washington, you say, the the Europeans are concerned that we don't care about them, people kind of roll their eyes because of course we care, but we also care about a lot of other countries and other things. And lest I repeat it, we care very sincerely domestically right now. I think one positive of the Biden administration is that they are intent on resuming our relations with foreign partners, whether in Europe or whether in Asia. And there is a recognition that in order to deal with some of the things that bother us, we need to have friends and allies to work with. And Europe is obviously important in that regard. I think the president's on his way to Rome today, missing Halloween, by the way, which is causing some kind of angst here because you can't hand out candy at the White House if the president's not there. All those little kids with masks on. But I think there's also been, I will tell you quite frankly, from my days as a trade negotiator, there was always a question about whether Europe would be with us and ready to stand up on something, or whether they wanted to just kind of be the middleman and not take a side. And that was always frustrating. And I think you see that in some of the rhetoric today. I hope, it's easy to be cynical, Matthias. And I can be a cynic. I've been a cynic in the past, but I hope, the stakes are pretty high right now on a lot of issues that member states need to figure out and the EU needs to figure out, and we need to figure out how we want to deal with things like privacy. There's a discussion in this country. But one of the lessons I think from TTIP on the regulatory side was it's very difficult to deal with policies that are already in place because every policy has an owner. They didn't start as an owner, but they're an owner now. And you can see that now in some of the 232 things, sanctions. But it's much more productive, and the regulators are much more amenable to having discussions with their counterparts on issues that they're starting to regulate. So you work together before you get to the end point, and there's perhaps better chance of being able to converge on something that works for both sides and works globally.
Yeah, indeed. Ed, over to you. So where would you say, what's the bandwidth in American politics right now to deal with technology issues, specifically with Europe? Does it have any strategic content at all in your analysis, or it's more sort of pure commercial trade related issues? Is there an intention to try to accept that this initiative may lead to collaborations that require some degree of compromises done by America on certain technology issues where America may also feel sort of that it's pretty well ahead of Europe in terms of its own commercial and economic success in those areas? So I think my question is, I'm trying to figure out for myself where this issue sits in American politics. What type of energy is it charged with?
Well, that's a great question. It's something that I think about and wonder myself. So my answer to you probably will be more in sort of guesses and feelings than it is really precise. I know exactly where this is going to go. I'd say one, as a first point, Elena's observation, the U.S. is very domestically focused right now, is quite true. That we have had, over the past year and a half, 750,000 people dead from COVID. That's a major concern for every individual person in the United States right now. How do we move past this point where we've made a lot of medical progress? Most people are vaccinated. There's some resistance. What does it mean for me? What does it mean for my job? What do I do next? We have in the Republican Party, I think, really a question about what is their future identity, and is it going to be ultimately more on the sort of McCain internationalist Atlanticist view, or is it going to be something that's much more inward-looking and defensive about the world? And that's an open question. Congress very preoccupied with infrastructure, with domestic legislation of various sorts, whether they're in favor of it or not. Right now, I don't think Congress has a very sort of intent. I don't think Congress is really thinking very intently about trade policy right now. Biden administration, I think, is very concerned and very interested in revitalizing and stabilizing and shoring up America's friendships and alliances with EU, and probably at the top. I think that's a very sincere feeling within the administration. That was what we were hearing, within the USTR, right up until I left, and I'm sure it's still now. I think they feel quite good that TTC is launched. They want it to succeed. I think it's important, and I think when you speak about the technology issues, I think the American political system generally and a lot of the public are quite sensitized right now to some of these topics. That over the past several years, there has been a series of quite malign and malevolent uses of technology directed against the American political system, against America's top-tier innovative companies and research institutes. I think that is generally seen as a significant and serious problem in the United States, both on the economic, commercial side and on the political, social, strategic side. So I think there's quite a lot of will in the administration and a consciousness in the public and Congress that these are important and pressing matters, that they're not purely matters of kind of minor commercial advantage that we might have over some other countries. And the administration, I think, both for that reason and because it wants to be stabilizing and building up our core alliances, is quite interested in making the TTC work and quite interested in finding solutions to issues such as digital services tax, such as Airbus, Boeing, and they have been steadily and consistently working at these. I think with a fairly good support from Congress, to the extent that Congress is looking at this, which isn't really intense right now. So, from the American political system, I think there are big questions that are open, and I don't know where they're going to wind up, but I do think with respect to this particular set of topics, especially the technology side of TTC, this is something the United States is taking quite seriously and wants to succeed.
Yep, very good. Thank you for that. Stormy, you had a very good structure for analyzing past initiatives. So if you apply that structure to this initiative right now, so what's the conclusions? Looking at the outcomes from Pittsburgh, have the two sides identify a good selection of issues to work on? Have they a strategy for how to deal with stakeholder participation, for instance? What would be your take?
I think that both the topics are well chosen, the agenda is well set, and also the stakeholder structure, at least on the European side, as I can see it, is pretty well set up also with regard to the communication. We all know that there have already been stakeholder meetings and hearings. So there's a huge difference from the start on in comparison to TTIP and the tech, where there was actually pretty little transparency in the beginning and rather little involvement of stakeholders. I'm not so sure if the involvement of the parliament is good enough. I think a little bit more needs to be done there in terms of thinking about then also the ratification processes where we need ratification, but I mean, there's also a lot of expertise in the parliament, which I think can be tapped in a little further. There's one, I think, really tricky issue, however. I think both sides learned that the agenda shouldn't be too ambitious and that you should not put certain issues onto the table and the agenda. These are trade issues like subsidies. These are tariffs on steel and aluminum. This is what we want to do in the Doha, in the WTO, and with the appellate body, and a few other sticky issues. So they are on purpose excluded from this endeavor. And because the lessons learned from the tech was that it can be a disaster to put sanitary and phytosanitary measures, for example, on the table. And back then, even the chlorinated chicken became somewhat of a litmus test for the tech and bogged down the whole tech negotiations even before TTIP. So I think this is the aim. On the other hand, I'm not so. And another motivation is hoping that there will be positive spillovers, get a positive agenda going through the through technology, and hoping that this will positively spill over into the other areas, leading also to progress there. It could work the other way around, though, that there will be negative spillovers from the other areas if we do not pay enough attention to the other areas. So I think there needs to be a separate track, so to say, not in the Trade and Technology Council, but apart from this, we do need to work on the other issues as well to prevent that we will have negative spillovers onto the technology agenda. And you probably also saw that in the last couple of days, there was some thinking about which pragmatic compromise could be found on the issue of steel and aluminum tariffs. Certainly not quotas, certainly not voluntary export restraints. Those are red lines on the European side. But how about a monitoring system, as was agreed to between the US, Canada, and Mexico? Would that be maybe a compromise? Because the tariffs are there and probably going to stay if a compromise isn't found. And if they continue to stay, they would have a negative spillover, definitely, onto the Trade and Technology Council. So I think it would be naive to think that you can completely separate all the tricky trade issues from the positive tech issues. And by the way, not all tech issues are also positive. I mean, digital data flows, for example, and data protection is an issue, which is also very, very tricky. And then I would like to add one more dimension. From the US side, I think there's a clear strategy behind this. As we heard, it has a lot to do with geopolitics, geoeconomics, countering China. This is also why investment screening is high on the agenda. Export controls are high on the agenda. And the EU needs to deliver on this. So we just had a dual-use export control reform, which was very differently oriented, though, right? I mean, we looked at human rights issues and not so much on new technologies and how to integrate that into the controls. And with regard to investment screening, we on the European level, it's more of a coordinating mechanism, right? And not a European investment screening per se. So if the expectation on the US side, which I think that it is there, that the EU will also substantively deliver on upgrading our system in these two areas, we might run into a little bit of a disappointment if we don't do expectation management here, because it's not so easy to do. Just think about how long our dual use reform took. 7-8 years, and investment controls, the harmonization of that among all 27 EU member states, that would be a big chunk to bite off. So this is just a couple of cautions with regard to the initiative.
Thank you. Matthias, basically building on what Stormy just said, so if we look at the agenda itself, and my question here is basically going to be how you analyze the agenda, the issues that are there, other issues missing, because as Tommy just said, I mean, there are one element here, which is that we have chosen, or at least the leaders have chosen, to focus on a couple of issues where there is no common European policy. Building on what Stormy said, we have on, for instance, on export control issues, on technology, we have a dual-use system which has been reformed, but I think it would be a consensus opinion among every person who knows anything about these issues that this reform doesn't go far enough, and that we have a pretty substantial degree of variation inside the EU on how that policy is actually applied in specific circumstances. So something can get approved in one country that wouldn't be approved in another country. We have, as Stormy mentioned, investment screening, where it's a coordination mechanism, but there is no real policy substance here in terms of defining and determining what type of investments that would be critical or problematic from a viewpoint of either security or sort of a broader social analysis. We have semiconductors we could add here as well, where there is an attempt to have a so-called CHIPS Act in the EU, but we're basically coming down to a situation where we don't really have a semiconductor policy, and we never had it. And I think it can raise several question marks over about whether Europe can have a semiconductor policy more generally, since European businesses tend to be positioned in different parts of the value chains of the semiconductor, and for many of them, they sort of trying to figure out what the value of spending a lot of resources on this issue would be. So if we flip this around, and if I may use this as an opportunity to take you out from some of your initial cynicism, Matthias, could this possibly also be sort of an opportunity for an initiative like that? You can build more stronger member state participation in an initiative like this. We don't need to use the standard formula of negotiating policies that are clearly within the area of EU competence, where there are huge differences between member states of how they prioritize certain issues.
Oh, indeed. And let me just emphasize that I am probably the most optimistic person on this panel with regard to where we all end up in terms of
who knew?
In terms of common standards for technologies, trade, new business models, and so on and so forth. But what we need is indeed, I think you already mentioned this, we need a new structural setup, a new way to think about multilateralism or plurilateralism. And we should probably stop talking about the TTTC, or only mention the TTTC as a springboard towards a new type of multilateralism or plurilateralism. You mentioned a couple of policy areas and issues for which we find a lot of agreement, shared perspective on how to regulate certain things, and at the same time, a lot of disagreement on how to regulate things. You find agreement and disagreement in pretty much every policy area. And it is certainly difficult to find coalitions behind certain initiatives. For example, an initiative for the regulation of data, privacy, but also legal ad targeted at certain industries like the semiconductor industry. Let's look at this particular example. In the EU, there are a few countries who already have some capacities along the value chain of producing semiconductors that can compete with those produced in third countries. Others don't, but they would be required to subsidize companies that already have the capacities to perhaps become, or hopefully become, more internationally competitive and contribute to value chain resilience in the EU. So there is a lot of potential for dispute and tension. When it comes to the scope of the items and the agenda of the TTTC, I think it's good. I think the narrative is convincing. It is appealing to policymakers across party ideologies, and I think the items listed in the agenda are ranging from investment screening to export controls to regulation of new technologies, software algorithms, and so on. I think it's merited. What is probably missing is a clear agenda. There's some mentioning of these items, but I think what's missing is a clear agenda on energy and climate-related policies, because they already have, and they are likely to have a larger impact on trade and investment, including in the transatlantic relationship. What is bad, and to come back to your question, Frederick, what is bad to me is less the scope of the policy areas. It's more about those that are currently involved in the talks and how individual member states are actually represented in these talks and will finally be affected. The forum is primarily set to coordinate laws in the transatlantic partnership, relationship. However, as said before, facilitating meaningful cooperation on highly complex economic and highly complex technological issues is not an easy task, even among friends of democracy and human rights in Washington and Brussels. Lessons should be drawn from WTO proceedings, I think. Lessons should also be drawn from myriads of trade agreements and free trade blocs, including the EU single market, which all demonstrate that there's a considerable political impediment for regulatory cooperation and also the implementation of joint regulations. And this applies in particular to measures that are intended to abolish trade distortive practices. This is one thing. Another thing is the exclusivity of the forum. I think that an exclusive forum, an exclusive partnership between the EU and the US, whether or not it's on controversial issues or less controversial issues, it will always fall short of its actual potential, the potential of what could be achieved through a more inclusive strategic alliance of market-oriented economies, market-oriented democracies, I shall say. Extending the TTTC platform to like-minded countries would not only amplify the desired impacts on trade and innovation, it would also underpin the ambition of the US and the EU to preserve what I would call a liberal world economic order. And it would not only send an important signal, it would also increase the clout needed for noticeable impacts on innovation capacities, on trade, and also investment. And in terms of the structure, it requires more of an a la carte approach rather than a setup where parties must agree on everything and sign up on everything. But I can come back to this in a minute if you want. But I think that the TTTC, which we should stop talking about, could indeed serve as a springboard for a deeper alliance between the US and the United States, but it should be fought much, much bigger.
Many thanks, Matthias. Let me just say before going back to Elena that some of you have already sent me questions, and do feel free, everyone, to forward questions to me if you want me to weave them in the conversation. So, Elena, I noticed that you mentioned the word privacy in one of your previous comments, and I thought, aha, there we have a controversial issue. So my understanding of TTC is basically that they're not going to deal with privacy issues. At least that has been the declarations that have come from the European Union, which of course comes from the fact that there are at least two important judgments from the European Court of Justice on the type of arrangements that we've had bilaterally to deal with privacy issues transatlantically in the past, and they've both been basically shut down by the European Court of Justice. And of course, this is also leading to a lot of problems on the European side, where they are trying to figure out what type of solutions that could be. So looking at the agenda, then the agenda that you think would be sort of important to have for an initiative like this, is it really viable that we build an agenda which is not going to include some of the core frictions that exist between the EU and the United States, at least where there are divergences? I struggle for myself to understand sort of how can you charge an initiative like this with good positive vibes if you decide that some of the major policy frictions that exist in the areas of technology, or those areas that we're going to talk about here, are not going to be dealt with?
So I think you have to be careful in making sure that you address issues that need to be addressed, but not overload a new structure in a way that it's going to fail. So when I mentioned privacy, we have a patchwork of laws that are under discussion in our country. The EU has the GDPR, which I'm reminded of every time I go to Europe and I try to turn my computer on, and I get, but it's not clear to me that everything has to be dealt with in the TTTC. See, I can pronounce that now. But the point is, you need to address the issues somewhere. And I think what's happening now, what I see in the TTTC, there's a discussion on data governance and tech platforms with issues that need to be discussed. And then there's a separate effort going on to deal with Privacy Shield and how that goes forward. I think there are a lot of issues like that are being dealt with somehow, but not necessarily in the TTTC. And the other thing, which we saw a little bit in TTIP, was sometimes if you put it all in the structure, you can actually delay progress on some issues because they're linked to other things and there's a timeline. And maybe you're better off dealing with some issues separately, but dealing with them without having them connected to the timing and structure and meeting schedule of another initiative. And I think that's where we are on the Privacy Shield issues. I mean, but recognizing that those big difficult issues are also political, and that there are eventual possible repercussions and lack of progress on some of those issues with what may be happening in an initiative like the TTTC. It's tricky, but it needs to be handled carefully and wisely.
What's your take, Ed? And sort of, if I ask you to comment on the agenda and what others have said, but also ask another question related to it. So we have a very loose format for TTTC. Isn't that a risk that everything is just going to run into the sand, that there is no real agenda, no time pressures, you haven't sort of established an idea what the target for these working groups that are now going to get going, what they're going to achieve? Could this be a recipe for failure?
I suppose it could, but I feel that the last attempt at TTIP had those things of a defined goal and timetable and clear outline of the things that needed to be done, and that didn't work. So having had that experience, why not try something else? Sometimes you try things that don't work. Maybe TTTC will work in some areas, but not in others. But I don't think that's particularly a bad outcome. So I think it is it's worth trying a new approach. I think some of the issues involved aren't ones that you can really look to a binding agreement as a solution to. That often the solution will be a kind of joint effort on common problems related to third countries, or learning more and more about one another's approaches. So I don't think a looser structure and different working groups is guarantee of failure. But it's not a guarantee of success either. I would feel like there's a very difficult challenge that a number of people alluded to, is that there are a series of really difficult issues. The privacy shield is one of them, and if you put those to the side and don't work on them, then they may kind of overshadow what you're doing. They have, on both sides of the ocean, very strong stakeholder groups of support. So why you're not working on the topic that we believe is the most important. But it is also very much the case that difficult issues, either of very large scale or small scale, can make it impossible for us to succeed on issues that aren't so difficult, but may also be at large scales, or are new and emerging in real time. And so I would say, taking the question of data regulation and privacy on one hand versus disinformation and cyber theft campaigns that are operated by either third-party governments or entities closely linked to those governments, it would be a mistake to say until we agree on how to solve this one, we can't work together on that. And so I think that is one of the virtues of this TTT concept, is that you can take up these issues and maybe make a fair amount of progress on them, while recognizing that maybe we can't solve this one right now and shouldn't make it a barrier to this other priority.
Yeah, indeed. Stormy, I think sort of our general expectation is that a lot of impetus for this initiative has to come, at least in Europe, has to come from Germany. Not just being sort of the major economy, but also being one of the major economies that perhaps has the strongest transatlantic orientation of them all. Where does this issue sit in Germany, and how do you see sort of the agenda linking up with new political developments in Germany? I was sort of searching the other day for different sort of snippets that have come out from the coalition talks between the three parties that are now trying to form a government in Germany. And I thought to myself, by reading it, going into looking at issues like, for instance, sort of digital policies, platform policies, how that's going to link up with energy policy or transport policy. Reading it, I thought, oh my God, I mean, this looks like very distinctly anti-American, in the sense that some of these issues seem to have been designed in order to avoid having big US platforms to participate in them. So I imagine there's going to be political frictions in Germany coming from an initiative that may sort of fuel more collaboration with the United States on issues. So where does this issue sit in Germany and its current political development?
Let's start with the easy part and with the with the stakeholders. So there's great support by the business community, and through the TTIP negotiations, there was also a lot of learning what it means to cooperate on regulatory issues, and a greater understanding of the structures both on the EU and especially on the US side, what is doable, what isn't doable. And I know that my old former colleagues at BDI are working on a lot of proposals, what to feed into the triple TTC. So there's great support for that. There is a lot less opposition in civil society because it is not a big trade deal and does not include a lot of tricky issues. But having said this, it's really important to include the consumer groups as well as the unions early on in this endeavor. So not to prevent that a new opposition is going to emerge, because it has a relevance on consumer protection issues, and they were extremely interested in data issues, or they are extremely interested in data issues. So this is something to take into consideration. With regard to the government side, we have a new coalition, or we will have a new coalition, a new government. And while I think in a lot of issues with regard to substance, there isn't going to be a big pivot, we also know that currently we are very internally focused. We are very much looking at our own government formation. Then another issue for next year is our relationship with France. And you saw that when the AUKUS deal came about and the French US frictions, we did voice our support for the French government. So that is something also to take into consideration. And it's, as Matthias, I think Matthias, you said it, that some issues are lacking, for example, climate issues, which I think the Greens would very much like to integrate into the agenda. There will be some new friction or old frictions, newly revised on NATO and 2% spending. There's still the issue of the trade balance and so on. So there are still a lot of conflictual areas we have to tackle. Last point is, well, I think that there's a lot of support for transatlantic relations in all three parties, obviously with the Liberals, but also with the Greens. There's also a part of the SPD who is a little bit more critical towards the transatlantic relationship. And there's also a part in the SPD who is more Russia friendly, which leads us to another issue, conflictual issue, which is Nord Stream 2, which is also not yet quite solved. And I have to say, I have to jump off because it's already 4, and I need to get into another panel discussion, unfortunately. But it was a great pleasure to join all of you and to learn so much today.
Thank you very much, Stormy. See you soon. We're also going to end very soon, but finally, I'm going to give the floor to you, Matthias, and I'm going to it's a question about the political energy from a European point of view here. I noted the other day in Politico that Wolfgang Ischinger, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, was saying that Europe needs to have a much stronger security orientations in its entire policy, especially in the field of technology and data. And he proposed the introduction of a European Security Commissioner with the ability to vet many of the policies that comes out from the viewpoint of national security. What are the chances of increasing its success if we frame this initiative as a Tech Nato, that this is part and parcel of an idea by Europe and America to create an alliance in order to deal with future type of issues, some of which are going to have strong defensive or security policy linkages?
Yeah, thanks, Frederick. I also came across Ischinger's intervention, which also aimed at influencing the coalition talks in Germany with regard on their thinking on about national security issues, including nuclear weapons and so on and so forth. I think we can learn from the NATO in general, also how it is organized. We can draw some lessons with regard to the shape of the TTTC, or another positive, more pragmatic agenda that is more likely to succeed with regard to the objectives and the vision raised by the political figureheads behind it. First of all, I think it's important to recognize that these overarching principles are not only shared by the US government and governments in the EU member states, they are also shared by a wider group of OECD countries, for example, or other emerging market-oriented democracies. And here's one big common denominator that I see between a future TTTC, or let's say a NATO for trade and technology, and the traditional NATO as we know it. Frederick, I know we started the conversation about how cooperation under such an organization could be shaped. I think an important mandate of a NATO for, let's say, trade and technology would be to be defensive only in regard to protecting an economic order that is open and where rules are designed, implemented, and enforced in a non-discriminatory manner, thereby encouraging competition, free trade, but also the exchange of ideas, the exchange of innovation, and so on. I think such a type of NATO would not, as others pointed to, call on members to exert collective pressure on countries that are found to violate WTO law. I think Robert Atkinson came out with this idea a few months ago, introducing the concept of NATO in the realm of economic diplomacy. I think a more promising concept would seek for plurilateral agreements. I mentioned this before, allow a subset of countries to agree on certain standards in certain areas and rules that then only would apply to the signatories of these standards or policies. So in practice, this would mean that the members of, let's say, a NATO for trade and technology should not seek for a single undertaking, but aim at consensus-based decision-making within the scope of an a la carte approach. And given the difference in political preferences, and here Ed referred to it, Stormy and also Elena referred to it, a Tech Nato or a NATO for trade and tech would imply representation of individual countries in the negotiations, including, from my point of view, individual EU member states.
All right, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you. We unfortunately are going to close here. I think we could continue for a long time. It's been very enlightening for me to learn more about how you think and weigh up the different aspects of the Transatlantic Trade and Technology Council. Hopefully this is an area which we have to come back to much more often in the future, because that would probably signal that there is success. But one of the positive things I take away from this conversation is the, at least for me, a growing optimism that we can have a format which is perhaps less formal, but increases the chances of achieving outcomes more than we've seen in the past. We titled this event, whether America and Europe are now putting the band back together again. And you know from Blues Brothers that they had some struggles in actually putting the band back together again. They had to do things that perhaps you wouldn't normally do. And when they had put the band back together again, it wasn't really a band, but they still played very good music. And that's perhaps is my takeaway point, that we don't really need to have the band, but we can still play good music together. So thank you very much, Elena, Ed, Matthias, and also to Stormy, who has already left us. Thank you to all that participated and shared comments, questions in the chat with us, and thank you to all of you who have watched us elsewhere as well. It's been a great afternoon, and see you soon.